Last time, we considered Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason and his use of the principle of sufficient reason in proving God's existence. Recall, the principle of sufficient reason is a commitment to the intelligibility or the explicability of all contingent things. That is, things that exist when they might not have existed, or things that are some way when they might have been some other way. For Leibniz, the ultimate reason why things are, and why things are the way they are, is God's rational choice to create the best of all possible worlds. So the principle of the best is the first metaphysical principle that Leibniz derives from the principle of sufficient reason. This principle states that the reason why things exist, and the reason why things are the way they are, is God's rational choice to create the best of all possible worlds. Now, what we're going to consider this time is a series of consequences that Leibniz thinks follow from the principle of sufficient reason and the principle of the best. Some of these consequences arise from Leibniz's attempt to rebut objections. The first of these arises on page 40 in our text. Here, Leibniz writes, "It is rather difficult to distinguish the actions of God from those of creatures, for some believe that God does everything." Although it's not immediately obvious, what Leibniz is doing here is attempting to answer an objection. The objection is that it follows from the principle of sufficient reason that all there is God, or that everything that happens is an action of God's. Why might this seem to follow? Well, suppose my hand goes up. For Leibniz, what's the reason my hand goes up? What's the explanation of my hand going up? It might seem that this explanation refers immediately to God. That is, it might seem that, for Leibniz, the reason my hand goes up is that God creates the best of all possible worlds, and in the best of all possible worlds, my hand goes up. The objection is that this seems to leave me completely out of the story. It makes it look like my hand going up is never my doing, but always God's doing. It makes it look like I cannot raise my hand. My hand rises only due to God's raising it. The thought is, we need to get me in the causal explanation. So Leibniz acknowledges that it might seem difficult, on his view, to distinguish individual substances from God, or the actions of individual substances from God's actions. But here's the way Leibniz proposes to do it. Leibniz's claim is that instead of God performing every individual action, instead what God does is God creates a number of individual substances, and in creating these substances, God endows these substances with a complete concept, which serves as the ground for every truth about the individual substance. So the thought here is that the explanation of my hand going up isn't immediately that my hand goes up because God creates the best of all possible worlds, and in the best of all possible worlds my hand goes up. Instead, the causal explanation of my hand going up refers to me. The reason my hand goes up is that it's in the nature of my substance for my hand to go up. So my hand going up follows from my nature. Next question, why is it in my nature for my hand to go up now? Here the answer is God's creation of the best of all possible worlds. So Leibniz's thought is, when God creates the best of all possible worlds, he creates a variety of individual substances, and he creates them with a nature, and then, from the natures of the individual substances, their actions follow. This, then, is what Leibniz calls the complete concept principle. Leibniz articulates this on page 41, writing, "We can say that the nature of an individual substance, or of a complete being, is to have a notion so complete that it is sufficient to contain and to allow us to deduce from it all the predicates of the subject to which this notion is attributed." So Leibniz's complete concept principle states that the nature of every individual substance, which Leibniz also calls a monad, is a complete concept that contains the ground of every truth about that individual. And again, the point of Leibniz's complete concept principle is to allow him to distinguish God from individual substances, and God's acts from the acts of individual substances. God's acts consist in creating every individual substance with a nature, and the acts of the individual substances are what follow from those natures. The next consequence that follows from the complete concept principle is called the mirror of the world principle. Leibniz writes on page 42, "Every substance is like a complete world, and like a mirror of God, or of the whole universe, which each one expresses in its own way. It expresses, however confusedly, everything that happens in the universe, past, present, or future." So the mirror of the world principle states that every monad contains in it an entire history of the world, albeit from a unique perspective. So the thought here is that if all the truths about me are grounded in the nature of my individual substance, then it's not just all the monadic truths, the truths about me and me alone, that are grounded in my nature, but also all the relational truths about me. All the truths that relate me to another individual substance are grounded in my nature too. So one truth about me, grounded in my nature, is that I was born in 1982. Another truth about me, grounded in my nature, is that I was born 212 years after Beethoven. And a third truth about me, grounded in my nature, is that I was born 141 years after Dvorak. In this way, my nature provides a perspective, as it were, on the birthdays of Beethoven and Dvorak. It's not in my nature that Beethoven be born in 1770, but it can be deduced from my nature that Beethoven was born in 1770, since it's in my nature to be born in 1982 and to be born 212 years after Beethoven. So in this way, my nature provides a perspective on Beethoven's birth, and indeed a perspective on every other event that has ever happened or will happen. This is the sense in which my individual substance is a mirror of the entire world. Another consequence of the complete concept principle is what's called the worlds apart principle. Leibniz states this principle on 47. He writes, "Each substance is like a world apart, independent of all other things except for God. Thus, all our phenomena, that is, all the things that can ever happen to us, are only consequences of our being." The thought here is that if all of the truths about me follow from the complete concept that is my nature, then none of the truths about me are made true by anything else other than God. In particular, none of the truths about me are made true by the causal effects of other substances on me. So what the worlds apart thesis states is that there's no causal interaction among monads. To see how this principle follows, consider why the complete concept principle was introduced. We had a fact about me, that my hand goes up, and we wanted the causal explanation for my hand going up to refer to me and not immediately to God. So for Leibniz, the causal explanation of my hand going up was that it's in my nature for my hand to go up. For another example, suppose you hit me. That you hit me is a truth about you. So for Leibniz, this must be grounded in your nature. So the reason why you hit me, for Leibniz, is that hitting me is in your nature. But now, a truth about me is that I am hit by you. Why am I hit by you? For Leibniz, it's not because you hit me. The truth that I am hit by you is a truth about me. And for Leibniz, the truths about me are all grounded in my nature. So the reason why I'm hit by you isn't that you hit me. The reason I'm hit by you is because it's in my nature to be hit by you. A question that obviously arises here is, if the reason I get hit by you isn't that you hit me, why is it that I always get hit by you at exactly the same time as you hit me? Leibniz acknowledges on 47 that it's very true that the perceptions of all substances mutually correspond in such a way that each one coincides with others. Leibniz's explanation of the coincidence of all of our perceptions and all of our phenomena is his thesis of pre-established harmony. Pre-established harmony states that God alone, from whom all individuals emanate continually, and who sees the universe not only as they see it, but also entirely differently from all of them, is the cause of this correspondence of their phenomena, and makes that which is particular to one of them public to all of them. So the thought here is that when God creates each individual substance, God doesn't do it willy-nilly. Instead, God creates individual substances from the standpoint of reason. God creates the rationally best possible world. So now, the thought is, a world in which you hit me, but I do not get hit by you at the same time, is a deeply irrational world. A world that God couldn't create, given that God's creation is guided by his knowledge of the rationally best of all possible worlds. So the thought is, when God creates all of the individual substances and endows each of the individual substances with a nature, God coordinates these natures from the standpoint of reason, such that all of their phenomena correspond. So the principle of pre-established harmony states that in creating the rationally best of all possible worlds, God coordinates all phenomena such that, even though there is no causal interaction among monads, all their phenomena correspond, just as if there were causal interaction among them. Now, I think these principles, the worlds apart principle, the mirror of the world principle, and the principle of pre-established harmony, are highly unintuitive, in marked contrast to the very intuitive principle of sufficient reason. So a question that you might consider in writing your papers is whether these principles really do follow from the principle of sufficient reason. If we accept the principle of sufficient reason, as Leibniz thinks we all implicitly do we have to accept pre-established harmony? Do we have to accept the worlds apart principle and the mirror of the world principle? Why does Leibniz think these principles follow from the principle of sufficient reason? And is he right? In particular, Leibniz introduces the complete concept principle in order to distinguish the actions of individual substances from the actions of God, and indeed to distinguish individual substances themselves from God. Two questions here are, is there another way to draw these distinctions? And is it really better to embrace pre-established harmony, the worlds apart, and mirror of the world principles, and the complete concept principle, than simply concluding that all there is God? Another principle of Leibniz's that follows directly from the principle of sufficient reason, he thinks, is the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. Leibniz articulates this on page 41. He writes, "It is not true that two substances can resemble each other completely and differ only in number." Leibniz's claim here is that if A and B are qualitatively identical, then they must be numerically identical. By the same token, if A and B are going to be numerically distinct, then they have to be qualitatively distinct. Remember, from a few lectures ago, to be qualitatively identical is to bear all of the same qualities. Or in other words, to look alike. To be numerically identical is to be one and the same thing. To be numerically distinct is to be two different things, while to be qualitatively distinct is to bear at least some different qualities. So what Leibniz is claiming here is that if two individuals bear all the same qualities, they must be the same thing, and that the only way two individuals can be different individuals is by bearing different qualities. Why I think that this follows from the principle of sufficient reason? I think there's two different ways to see Leibniz's point here. First, Leibniz holds that nothing happens without a sufficient reason to explain why it happens. Another way to put the point is that nothing exists without there being a rational need for that thing to exist. So now, let's suppose that A exists with a given set of qualities. Why does A exist? Why does A bear the qualities that it bears? There must be a rational need for A. Now, if there is a rational need for A, then A must exist. It must exist to satisfy the need for it. But now, if the rational need for something bearing all of A's qualities is already satisfied, then there can't be something else that bears all of A's qualities, because there couldn't be a rational need for that, since the rational need for it has already been satisfied by A. The other way to understand Leibniz's reasoning here is to think that if A and B are numerically distinct, that is, if A and B are different things, then there must be a reason for A and B being different. There has to be an explanation of what makes A and B different. Right? The thought here is that if someone told you, this water's boiling, but there's no reason why, you wouldn't believe them. Just the same, if someone told you A and B are different, but nothing makes them different, you wouldn't believe that either. If the water's boiling, something must have made it boil. And if A and B are different, something must make them different. Leibniz's thought is that if A and B bore all the same qualities, then there could be nothing that makes them different. One thing that might make A and B different is that they're different shapes. Another thing that might make A and B different is that they're different colors, or that they make a different sound, or that they're different ages. But if A and B bear all the same qualities, if they're the same shape and the same color and the same age and make the same sound, then the thought is there could be nothing that explains their difference. So this is why Leibniz thinks that if two things bear all the same qualities, they must be the same thing. Now, a final consequence of the principle of sufficient reason from this week's reading concerns the nature of space. This is discussed in the correspondence between Leibniz and Samuel Clarke. In this correspondence, Samuel Clarke defends Newton's position on the nature of space. Leibniz provides two arguments against Newton's position. One argument that cites the principle of sufficient reason, and another argument that cites the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. And Leibniz also puts forward an alternative to Newton's theory of space. Newton's theory is called absolutism, and Leibniz's theory is called relationalism. On Newton's absolutist theory, space and time are prior to bodies in space and events in time. The idea here is that space is what it is, independently of the bodies that occupy space. And likewise, time is what it is, independently of the events that take place in time. On this view, we could think of space and time as large containers that exist and have various properties, independent of whatever is put in them. Relationalism, by contrast, the view Leibniz defends, states that bodies and events are prior to space and time. On this view, bodies and events have intrinsic properties that are neither spatial nor temporal, and space and time are relational properties that supervene on the intrinsic property of the bodies and the events. Leibniz's first argument against absolutism cites the principle of sufficient reason. Clarke himself accepts the principle of sufficient reason, so there's no worry here that Leibniz is talking past Clarke. Leibniz writes, if space was an absolute being, something would happen for which it would be impossible that there should be a sufficient reason, which is against my axiom, and I prove it thus. Space is something absolutely uniform, and without the things placed in it, one point of space absolutely does not differ in any respect whatsoever from another point of space. Now, from this, it follows, supposing space to be something in itself, besides the order of bodies among themselves, that it is impossible there should be a reason why God, preserving the same situations of bodies among themselves, should have placed them in space after one certain particular manner and not otherwise, why everything was not placed quite the contrary way, for instance, by changing east into west. Leibniz's argument here is, premise 1, the principle of sufficient reason. Premise 2, if space and time were absolute, that is, if space and time were prior to or independent of the universe, then it would be a contingent fact that the universe occupies the region of space it does, and the span of time it does. For after all, it could have occupied a different region of space and a different span of time. But premise 3, there's no reason sufficient to explain why the universe occupies one region of space rather than another, and one span of time rather than another, since space and time are uniform and indeed infinite. Leibniz's thought in this argument is that if space were prior to the universe, or if space were what it is independently of the universe, that is, independently of all the bodies in space, then it would be a contingent fact that the universe is where it is in space. After all, if space were prior to the universe, then the universe could be in one region of space or in a different region of space. But now, if we're committed to the intelligibility or the explicability of all contingent natural phenomena, then we would be committed to providing a reason why the universe is where it is in space, or oriented the way that it's oriented in space. And now, Leibniz's claim is that because space is uniform, there could be no reason. But the thought here is that what would the reason be for the universe to be where it is in space? If there were outer boundaries of space, or if there was a center of space, or if part of space was more beautifully colored than another part of space, well, that could provide a reason for the universe being situated around the center, or away from the boundaries, or mostly in the pretty part. But the thought is, since space is absolutely uniform and has no boundaries, nothing about space could provide a reason for the universe to be located in one part of space rather than another. So Leibniz thinks it follows from this that space and time cannot be prior to or independent of the universe. Absolutism must be false. Leibniz's second argument against absolutism cites the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, rather than the principle of sufficient reason. Although, of course, we've seen that the principle of the identity of indiscernibles follows from the principle of sufficient reason. So this argument is based ultimately on the principle of sufficient reason too. This argument comes up in Leibniz's reply to an objection that Clarke raises against Leibniz's relationalism. Clarke raises this objection on page 19. He writes, "If space was nothing but the order of things coexisting, it would follow that if God should move in a straight line the whole entire material world, it would always continue in the same place. And if time was nothing but the order of succession of created things, it would follow that if God had created the world millions of ages sooner than he did, it would not have been created at all the sooner." So since Clarke holds that space is absolute, that space exists and is what it is, independently of the things in it, Clarke supposes that the whole universe could be moved in space, or that the whole universe could be moved in time, right? Clarke thinks that space could be held still while all the things in space are moved. That is, while the entire universe is moved in space. Leibniz thinks that this does follow from absolutism. Leibniz thinks it follows from absolutism, that the universe could be moved in space or in time, as Clarke does, in fact, suppose. But Leibniz thinks this violates the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. So on page 23, he writes, "To say that God can cause the whole universe to move forward in a right line, or in any other line, without making otherwise any alteration in it, is another chimerical supposition. For two states indiscernible from each other are the same state, and consequently it's a change without any change." So Leibniz's thought here is that the entire universe at one point of space and the entire universe at another point of space have all the same qualities. Again, the reason they have all the same qualities is that space is uniform. Nothing about being in one particular point of space gives the universe a different quality than the universe would have if it were at a different point in space. But now, it follows from the principle of the identity of indiscernibles that there couldn't be two different possible universes that differ only in virtue of being in different spaces. For being in two different spaces wouldn't give these two different possible universes any different qualities. And two things that have no different qualities can't exist. If A and B have all the same qualities, they must be the same thing. So in this sense then, there can be no difference between the universe being in one region of space versus the universe being in another region of space. So the whole universe couldn't be moved from one region of space to another region of space, as Clarke supposes. This, then, is Leibniz's second argument against absolutism. Premise 1 is the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. Premise 2 states that if space and time were prior to or independent of the universe, as absolutism holds, then there could be two numerically different things. The entire universe in one region of space and one span of time, and the entire universe in another region of space and another span of time. But premise 3 states, because space and time are infinite and uniform, the entire universe in one region of space and time would be qualitatively identical to the entire universe in any other region of space and time. The conclusion that follows is that space and time must not be prior to or independent of the universe. Absolutism must be false. Leibniz's relationalist alternative is to say that space and time are not prior to or independent of bodies in space and events in time. Instead, space and time are nothing but a system of relations among bodies and events. Individual monads and their phenomena are what they are, independently of space and time. and that space and time are just systems of relations among monads and their phenomena. Leibniz spells this out on page 45. He writes, "I will here show how men come to form the notion of space to themselves. They consider that many things exist at once, and they observe in them a certain order of coexistence. This order is their situation or distance. When it happens that one of these coexistent things changes its relation to a multitude of others, which do not change their relation among themselves, and that other thing, newly come, acquires the same relation to the others as the former had, we then say that it has come to occupy the place of the former. And supposing that among those coexistents there is a sufficient number of them which have undergone no change, then we may say that those which have such a relation to those fixed existence as others had to them before have now the same place which those others had, and that which comprehends all those places is called space." So the idea in this passage is that we form the idea of space first by noticing that various objects stand in distance relations among one another. By noticing how these distance relations change as the objects move, we come to form the idea of a place. So if you have three objects, A, B, and C, and if A and B stand in a certain distance relation, if B and C both move, such that C now comes to stand in the same distance relation to A that B once stood in relation to A, we'll say that C occupies the same place that B previously occupied. And Leibniz's thought is that space is just the name for all the possible places. So in this way, the concept of space is consequent to the set of all the possible distance relations, which themselves are consequent to the things that stand in these distance relations. So in this way, on the relationalist view, space and time are no more than systems of relations among bodies and events that are wholly dependent on the non-spatial and non-temporal properties of those bodies and events. In your papers, you can choose to write either about Leibniz's theory of monads, or you can enter into the absolutism-relationalism debate about the nature of space and time.